Hi everyone, thank you for joining us at the Reuters Events webinar today. The future of the FDA Accelerated Approval Program, AAP, and its impact on patient outcomes. We are here to delve into comprehensive insights of the FDA Accelerated Approval Program and its crucial impact on patient outcomes. This webinar is sponsored by Johnson & Johnson, and we have all the wonderful panelists on the screen. During the webinar, our expert will cover pivotal topics, including quantitative benefits, policy evaluation, and patient-centric policies. We will assess new specific evidence demonstrating the estimated life years gained by cancer patients due to earlier treatment access provided by the AAP. Let's learn how to develop health policies that prioritize patient outcomes and are founded on robust evidence to ensure future access to innovative therapies. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box on Zoom. Now, let me introduce our moderator, Bridget Doherty, a Master of Public Health MPH. She is a Director of Access and Policy Research at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine and is also known as a co-author of Life Years Gained from the FDA Accelerated Approval Program in Oncology, a portfolio model. And now, I'll hand it over to Bridget.
Thank you, Kana. It's an honor to be here discussing this important topic with this wonderful expert panel. Before I get started, let me introduce our panel. We have Dr. Peter Marks, Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, known as CBER, at the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Edward Nealon, Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Jenny Elstrom, CEO of Health Tree Foundation and a multiple myeloma patient. And my colleague, Silas Martin, Head of the Access and Policy Research Team at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine. Before we get into our discussion, I'd like to set some context around the Accelerated Approval Program and share some of the new research that Connor referred to on the program and its outcomes on patients. So let me first, most of you probably already know, the Accelerated Approval Program enables early access to drugs for patients with high unmet need. Those approvals rely on surrogate endpoints, and there's a requirement they be converted through confirmatory trials, okay? But since about 2020, we've seen what I would call a steady drumbeat of criticism around the program. There's a sampling of that kind of commentary on the slide here, but they kind of fall into three buckets. There's criticism regarding data, kind of inferring a less than approach, less than data, less than timing, less than endpoints. There's questions around the degree of uncertainty and risk that's built into the program. And there's also been some criticism around, quantifying the benefits at the time of approval. And all of this seems to be prompting calls to reform the program or make changes. But as a policy researcher, before you go to make a change, I think it's crucial that you assess the current impact of a program and a policy on patient outcomes so that you can understand what you're dealing with and what changes may occur to those patients if you start to undergo reforms. So with that in mind, we did a lit review. And what we came up with was an evidence gap. There's plenty of commentary and papers on the Accelerated Approval Program, but they tend to be very anecdotal. They tend to be numbers, so X amount approved, X amount withdrawn, or they tend to be like one product case studies where it has been like they kind of hint that this is indicative of the entire program. What we realized was missing was a population level assessment of the program and the clinical benefit to patients. So to fill this unmet need, we underwent a research project to do just that. We set out to quantify the clinical benefit of the Accelerated Approval Program by modeling the number of life years gained for patients with cancer as a result of the program. I'll go a little deeper into the methodology and assumptions in a few slides, but I think what is key to call out here with the time that we have is the data that we used. Yes, we used data from FDA studies, but we went beyond that. and we used data that we can find that had any overall survival indication for those products and indications that went through the program. Just as importantly, we use data on product uptake. In other words, how many patients are using these medications. And to do that, we use the Ipsos Oncology Uptake tool. In terms of assumption, our comparator for this study was basically the standard of care. As any good study does, it has limitations, which again, for the sake of time, I won't go into great detail here, but they are listed in the paper, and I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards who wants to go into them. But I think the key here for this conversation is the findings are specific to the time frame, and examined and may not be generalizable for the future. So let's go back to the methodology real quick and what were we looking at. We started with conversion status and overall survival availability. And we looked at oncology because for the most part, most of the products going through the program have been oncology, especially since 2006. So we start with how many products went through from 2006 to 2022. And you start with a number of 130. Then we break that down into buckets. Of that 130, 57 had been fully converted, okay? Of that 57, we were able to find OS data for 50 of it. So that went into the model. What we think is critical in this study, again, we're looking at a holistic view of the program. You need to include the withdrawn, right? If we're looking at the program's effectiveness. Within that time frame, 18 indications were withdrawn. Of which of those 18, we could find data on 12. So 12 of those are in the model. And then at the time of the cutoff of our study, 55 were ongoing. 40 of those were still on time, they just weren't due yet. But of that 55, we were still able to get 7, okay? And with that, we ended up with 69 indications. And keep in mind that some products have multiple indications. So that's why I'm using the term indications. Then let's go to the model itself. What's critical about the program? The program's purpose is that earlier access, right? Patients get earlier access than they would if the treatment went through the regular approval. So that is what we wanted to study. What is happening to patients from the time of that accelerated approval to the time of that conversion? So that is what we were looking at. And it's a counterfactual model, right? The top of that graphic is this is what's happening now. This is the uptake during that period. The idea is if you took that away or changed it in some way, what's happening to that patient during that time? What are you gaining or losing if you take away that capability? And how did we do that? We linked that OS data I talked to you about before. We linked it with the uptake data. And from that, we estimated the life years gained during that time of accelerated approval to the conversion. So what did we find? We had the manuscript published in the Journal of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. And what we found is our analysis estimated that the program gained around 263,000 life years across 69 products for about 911,000 cancer patients during that time period, again, from accelerated approval to conversion. You have to stop a model at some point, we all know that, but if we were a little bit less conservative and let it run a bit more, that number would go up to 382,000 life years. You can see on the right, we also did subset analysis, and on the right, you see it by cancer type. But we also looked at other subsets, and one was those that had an accelerated approval and an orphan designation. They had a gain of about 145,000 life years in about 264,000 patients, which was a 16.5% gain over standard of care. And again, we think it's critical to reinforce this includes the withdrawn indications, okay? Every outcome, no matter what the outcome, if we could get the data for it, it's in here. And this includes those withdrawn. And in fact, if you cut out the withdrawns as their own subset, they still had a net life year gain overall. So in terms of conclusions, we estimated from our study that the program is resulting in life years gained for oncology patients. And we think it's critical that we're looking, when we have these discussions around changes, that we are centering that discussion on data and evidence and outcomes that are important to those patients. Prior to this, we were having discussions changing this program without first quantifying the population level benefit. And our concern here is if you start doing that, you may make changes that could impact that positive impact on patient outcomes. There could be a risk of life years lost for patients, the millions of patients who have used it and will use it in the future if we don't understand fully what's going on right now. So with that, I thank you all. I want to start the conversation, and I would love to start with Dr. Marks. Dr. Marks, thank you for joining us. Can we take a step back, and can you give us more of a history of the Accelerated Approval Program and a contextual view of how it works and its impact on patient care?
Yeah, so accelerated approval was put together a couple decades back now with the concept that when there are products where there is a serious unmet medical need, it would be nice to get them to the benefit of patients as rapidly as possible. Normally, we approve things with traditional approval based on how people feel, function, or survive, but with science, there's increasingly the ability to have biomarkers or intermediate clinical endpoints. That is a laboratory value or perhaps some assessment that can be done, which is reasonably likely to predict that somebody is going to ultimately have clinical benefit. It doesn't mean they absolutely will, but it means that there is a reasonable likelihood. And we can argue all day over whether reasonable means 75% chance, 90% chance, 95% chance. But the point being that one can actually get a reasonable idea using something where you can have a readout potentially years sooner, if not in some cases months at least sooner. So months to years sooner by using a laboratory value or some type of an assessment that ultimately predicts. And the program doesn't say that's, it doesn't stop there, right? That gets you a fully approved product that allows reimbursement to occur. And then we have a requirement that the confirmatory clinical evidence from a trial on how someone feels, function, or survive is ultimately submitted to the agency. Now, one of the things by way of history that has led to some of the criticism of the program is that some companies were slower than perhaps they should have been in getting us those data in the past. But Congress has given FDA the power more recently to make sure that there is timely attention paid to these studies. In fact, in the most recent update to our user fee acts, now we have a situation where, in fact, the companies can be asked to make sure that the confirmatory trial for accelerated approval is actually ongoing before a product is approved. So that's not always a must, but it's something that can be put in place. So I think these are tools that's kind of the background here that has made accelerated approval very useful. And I'll just, by way of background, also say that our center really does a lot of work in the rare disease space where the ability to use accelerated approval is quite important because for many slowly degenerative diseases, you want to intervene sooner rather than later. And if you had to wait the 3 to 5 years for a trial based on a clinical endpoint, you would have many, for instance, children who would have irreparable damage that you can prevent by intervening years sooner.
You're
Oh,
muted.
Bridget, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that. Can you also talk about the standard of effectiveness? Because that's come into question about, is it the same type of approval?
So the requirement, the statutory requirement is the same. You have to have substantial evidence of effectiveness. So you have to show that the biomarker compellingly works. You can't just say, oh, it kind of looks something like it might work. It actually has to meet. And that means that we generally have a statistical construct that says that something, it has met a statistical construct that says that it has a substantial evidence of effectiveness on that biomarker or intermediate clinical endpoint. So it is every bit an approval. Until more recently, and again, this we can have some dialogue over if you'd like. Until more recently, these accelerated approvals were considered essentially interchangeable with traditional approvals from the standpoint of reimbursement. As we've seen, there's been some more controversy now where sometimes it's felt like, oh, well, an accelerated approval maybe isn't the same as a traditional approval. And so insurers have had more hesitancy perhaps in paying for these products. But from the FDA standpoint, this is every bit an approval that meets our standards. And one important thing that also distinguishes accelerated approval from conditional approval, which is a pathway present in Europe, is accelerated approval products have all of the rest of the car, so to speak. The engine is there just like it would be for any other product. In other words, there's full manufacturing data, full data on the toxicology of the product. So those are all present there. The single thing that's the difference is that we are using a surrogate endpoint rather than the final clinical endpoint.
That's great. Thank you, Doctor. Silas, from your perspective, what's the importance of this study that we just discussed to the discussion around the FDA Accelerated Approval Program?
Yes, thanks, Bridget. I think the importance of this study, in my opinion, is the bottom line, is that we are seeing with an analysis like this that patients are really getting an enormous benefit from the early access afforded by the FDA Accelerated Approval Program. And I would say you and I worked on this, and it was it's different from other analyses in a couple of ways. And I wanted to highlight those. I mean, we took up-to-date data, so not just the data that was ready out of accelerated approval, but the most up-to-date relative benefit data between the new drug and the standard of care, and then secondly, applied observed patient uptake data to calibrate that effect for the populations that are using the drug. And that is something that we haven't seen before, and this was a new way of displaying that information. So by using those data in a model, we were able to retrospectively apply this information to the patient cohorts that took the medicine at the point in time when there was more uncertainty. So we talk about uncertainty at the time of approval. It's a very difficult decision, in my opinion. I mean, that the FDA is looking at the data, deciding on these endpoints to move forward, and has the, like what you just heard, is the rigor is there as with any approval. But we're able to take and kind of retrospectively look back at what was the performance of those drugs over time, and it in some ways can address the issue of uncertainty at the decision point of accelerated approval, applying what we know now to the estimates of benefit back then. And so in this way, instead of counting numbers of trials that are done, we are able to look at the statistical evidence of survival, and then look at the patient level impact at the point of approval. I think this is a good way of looking at the performance of the program, and it's a good way of looking at retrospective way of looking at the program. Another thing I'll say is, in this sample, this oncology sample, linking patient uptake data to the overall survival data, we saw that the physicians who are prescribing these drugs and the patients are using the drugs in the areas where survival benefit was ultimately demonstrated. What's interesting when we look at the uptake data was that those that did not have overall survival data and those that were ultimately withdrawn actually represented less than 5% of the observed 1 million patients in the study, or almost 1 million patients. And that was an interesting finding to me, seeing that the scientific and medical community seem to understand the benefit risk as is conveyed in the information that's coming out through the trials, and that the current FDA process is delivering, good decision making, and we're seeing the benefits. And that's kind of through this retrospective analysis, we're able to see that kind of play out.
That's great. Thank you, Silas. Jenny, I'd love for you to talk about your patient journey through the lens of the impact of this program to you as a patient with multiple myeloma.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no question that the impact of the Accelerated Approval Program has been significant to both me personally as a myeloma patient and as an advocate at HealthTree Foundation on behalf of myeloma and other blood cancer patients. And really, myeloma is a perfect example. So since my diagnosis in 2010, we've really seen an explosion of new therapies, with now over 20 plus drugs being approved in myeloma, many of these coming through the Accelerated Approval Program, and all had orphan designation. So it's remarkable and I'm full of gratitude to FDA and these companies driving new innovation, because I and other patients I advise have personally benefited. But as we were planning for this meeting, I had a patient call me. His name was Bob, and he said, I've been on 10 lines of therapy. I'm out of options. My myeloma specialist is telling me I'm out of options. And we went through his chart to make sure that he, was saying that he had been, and yes, he had been. And his wife called me last week and he passed. So he was a dear friend, a health tree coach. I talk to patients like that regularly. We aren't done. We don't have a cure yet. And in attending the IMS conference last month, a quarter of newly diagnosed myeloma patients are living less than 3 years. And according to SEER data, 40% of patients are living less than 5 years. So because the way that this cancer keeps coming back over and over again, myeloma patients are going to use every tool in the toolbox during their lifetime, and we need more tools. So we need this innovation to continue.
I think that's great, Jenny. And first, I'm sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that. But I think it's critical because one of the critiques we've seen is they say there's unmet need, but there's various products within that disease state. And what you're saying is just because there's several does not mean there is no unmet need.
Many patients will relapse now with quad therapies being moved up to the front line. So many patients will relapse on 4 drug classes now at the beginning of their care. And you really want these patients to be living decades. So then what else do you have for them? It's a challenge.
That's great. Thank you, Jenny. Dr. Nealon, we've talked a lot about oncology. We focused on oncology because it's the majority, but we know that the rare disease community is also very involved and very concerned about the Accelerated Approval Program. Can you talk about the program and why it's important in the rare disease space?
Sure. Thanks, Bridget. Of course, some cancers are rare, and we don't want to overlook that fact. I think the rest of the rare disease community looks a bit towards the oncology progress, where good surrogate endpoints such as tumor size are available and have become accepted. And as you've mentioned, so far, a big proportion of accelerated approvals have been for oncology. But there's 10,000 or so rare diseases, including those that may not have, as clear a path. But at NORD, we feel it's very important to recognize, as Dr. Marks already said, that an accelerated approval is rigorous and it's the same statutory criteria for substantial evidence of effectiveness. But there are many rare diseases for which doing a clinical trial with a clinical endpoint is very hard to do, in part, and Dr. Marks already mentioned this, is because many rare diseases are slowly progressive and the trials would need to take a very long time. Other factors include that by their nature, rare diseases are rare. Multiple myeloma meets the FDA definition of an orphan disease because I think there's around 150,000 or so affected Americans and cutoff's 200,000. But there are many rare diseases where we only know of 100 patients in the United States or something like that. So it's very hard to do a traditional trial. With that small number of patients, it's hard to overcome heterogeneity. And you'd have to wait even longer, to get to a statistically significant result because of the small numbers of patients. And so having a surrogate endpoint, such as a biomarker that is reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit, can not only make the trial shorter, as Dr. Mark said, and allow all patients with that disease to start receiving it sooner, but it may be the factor that allows the trial to take place at all, because how else do you entice sponsors to work on such difficult projects for a small market share? There's also 70 or 80% of rare diseases that are of genetic origin. And I think for the genetic rare diseases, there's another element to it, which is that I can't tell you exactly why you might get a headache or exactly why, I have allergies living in California. But when I moved back to the East Coast, I don't. And it was exactly the opposite for my wife. But, we can tell you exactly why you have methylmalonic acidemia or cystic fibrosis, and exactly what's the molecular cause and what are the next few steps in the pathway leading to disease. And so we can see ways to intervene at those early steps with every reasonably likely belief that if we can intervene at those early causative steps, it should lead to a better clinical outcome. So, well, I mentioned, tumor size or things like that, that might be, pretty tried and true surrogate endpoints in certain cancers, solid cancers, right? For rare diseases, you may have to have a different surrogate endpoint for each disease, but for the genetic diseases, it's very obvious, and there's a lot of scientific evidence to what those biomarkers might be. So when you have this molecular understanding of the pathogenesis and the chance to identify a good biomarker to lead to an accelerated approval, you finally get to overcome some of those difficulties of the diseases being so rare and oftentimes progressive and very hard to study in the traditional trial with a final field function and survive clinical endpoint.
That's great. Thank you, Doctor. You mentioned something that I'd like to push on a little bit, and please, Dr. Marks, I'd love you to chime in as well. The program helps keep the focus on drug development in difficult and challenging areas. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start here, which is that, I mean, we keep it, a lot of it comes back to the fact that for any number of diseases that we would like to study in clinical trials, there are just challenges to getting to clinical endpoints. And there can be a variety of reasons for that, right? In the cancer space, you have people dying right now. And if you can get something to market months sooner by using an intermediate endpoint, which we have existing ones often in oncology, you can save lives. So the calculations, like the ones you've done, are very direct. And so there, the challenge is, can you use something that allows you to save more lives? And with you're basically taking a calculated risk. You might not have gotten it right, but the risk at that risk of not getting it right is the benefit is if you've gotten it right, you're going to save people's lives. And because for all of these, as you've already mentioned, the safety, whether it's an accelerated approval or a traditional approval, safety is something we're always taking into account here. And really what happens with an accelerated approval is that we just have a greater degree of uncertainty about efficacy, right? And that we're dealing with. So I think what we're saying here is that for the cancer patient, we want to get there as fast as we possibly can. And for that matter, for the rare disease patient, we want to get there as fast as we possibly can. But the other challenge there is, as we keep alluding to, in some cases, the natural course of disease can take a long time to progress. And in some cases, we don't have the perfect measure of how someone feels, functions, or survives to be able to latch onto, but we do have a biochemical marker that we can latch onto. And that means that it gives us, if we can do an approval based on that biochemical marker, it gives us a little more leeway into the exploration of how someone feels, functions, or survives for that subsequent clinical endpoint. So it is, I think it is a very important tool in the tool chest. And I actually view it as very important to avoid getting to a different place. And that is that if this helps us get access in a timely manner for products that meet a standard of effectiveness. If we don't have this, we then get into places where people are sometimes trying things through other pathways that have not met some effectiveness standard. And I think that's a shame, unless, obviously it's on a clinical trial, that's one thing. But unfortunately, some people get desperate enough that they go outside of clinical trials to try unproven therapies. So I think this pathway, for a variety of reasons, is very important for patients, both oncology and non-oncology patients.
That's great. And Dr. Mark, could you really quickly, because I think it's an area of confusion. We've talked before about late line therapy and then going earlier, and maybe just a little bit of context around that, because I think some people say like, oh, you're not comparing the same populations. maybe you could explain what the reasoning is
Yeah,
for that.
so in oncology, oftentimes as we develop products, they're first developed for people who have very advanced disease because there's nothing else out there, and any benefit that you can show, it's easiest to show benefit because the comparison is often doing nothing or just doing supportive care, and that's late line therapy. On the other hand, oftentimes products then move up once they've shown that they work in that setting, they ultimately come to benefit much larger populations of patients where they get moved up into earlier lines of therapy. And a good example recently comes from in chronic myeloid leukemia, where a product that was used kind of as a last line product was studied in the first line setting and turns out to be an outstanding product in the first line setting with effectiveness, and will probably become, if not the new standard of care, a new standard of care in terms of this. So this is something that happens, and biomarkers help us, get a grip on this in some cases, and allow us to get that first hint of efficacy in a more advanced population, and then studies get done in earlier stage populations. So ultimately, because it keeps the ecosystem of development going, it actually serves as an engine that helps development across both accelerated approval endpoints and non-accelerated approval endpoints, I think. I don't know. I'm sounding like an advertisement for accelerated approval, but I think there is some pushback to those that say, well, this isn't the real deal. No, it is the real deal. It's just that there's a greater degree of uncertainty, and ultimately, there is some art to calculating how much a degree of uncertainty you're willing to accept. And that degree of uncertainty may vary from indication to indication, right? If you have absolutely nothing out there for a disease, you might accept a greater degree of uncertainty than if there are 18 therapies out there.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Mark. Dr. Nealon, to go back to keeping the focus on drug development and very challenging, which is the exact area that you specialize in. What are your thoughts around that?
I think I want to pick up on one of the last things that Peter said. When he spoke about FDA properly being willing to accept more uncertainty in whether a particular surrogate endpoint really is going to predict clinical benefit when there are no other treatment options. I think for a large majority of the non-oncological rare diseases, there is no approved treatment. And in fact, the number's around 95% of the non-oncological rare diseases have no approved treatment. So they're all in that category where there's a great unmet need, and things that we can do, like accelerated approval, to get people to address these for small populations are vital.
That's great. Thank you. I'd like to talk about, we've talked about some of the criticism, and I think it's a program that can be misunderstood. So I'd like to ask some of you for some more context within your personal experience with the program. And Jenny, I want to start with you. One of the claims I read once, the quote was thin evidence around it. And from a patient perspective, you've talked about waiting. If we waited in your condition, we've been waiting a long time. When you hear that, what are your thoughts? What's your experience in that?
Well, I personally don't have time to wait. I don't know what other cancer patient would tell you that they have a lot of time to wait. And speaking to the examples that were used earlier, you think about, okay, there might not be any drugs in a particular rare condition, but even in myeloma, when there are a lot of drugs, you run out of those options. You continue to relapse. So it's the nature of that disease. So when it comes to approval, existing new tools and models really need to take into account risk, reward, and these landscape shifting paradigms. Just to give you an example, the standard endpoint in myeloma has always been overall survival, sometimes progression-free survival. But the blessing and the curse of these new advances in myeloma means that with patients living significantly longer, we might be waiting 10 or 15 years for the overall survival to read out. And how, with the myriad of, patients are getting treated in combination therapies and then moving to another line. So how do you actually tell which drug or line of therapy really contributed to that overall survival when patients are getting 3, 5, or 10 years lines of treatment? So it's complicated. And I think if you ask patients, they know the confirmatory trials are going to be following this up. And if they are out of options, they are out of options. So they will move to clinical trials that are offering them new options if they and their doctor have also jointly decided, there is nothing left for you.
Right. That's a great point that you said what patients know. One of the things I've read is patients should be alerted that they're on an accelerated approval drug. Would you say that most of you know that?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of patients might even know that. They know they're joining a clinical trial,
Mm-hmm.
and they might know that much, but they might not know that it's had accelerated approval.
Okay. Dr. Marks, can we talk a little bit about withdrawals? Because some of those withdrawals or some of those kind of case studies have been used as examples of possibly things wrong with the program. Could you talk to us about, again, the context of withdrawals and how you see it within the program?
No, so thanks. So there are a couple of reasons why withdrawals can occur. Withdrawals can occur because a confirmatory trial is conducted and it's negative. Confirmatory trials can be negative for two reasons. It can be because the drug doesn't work, or it could be because the trial itself, the design of the trial was incorrect. And so FDA has to always sort that out because we don't want to throw out a drug that works because the trial design was not appropriate. So we always check that first. But the other reason, aside from trials failing, is that sometimes someone decides not to conduct or complete out their trial. Now that's a problem because we can't have hanging accelerated approvals that hang forever. So in 2022, we were given a bit more of an orderly process that we can now use for withdrawing products if we need to. First of all, we have the ability to make sure that, as I mentioned, that the trials in many cases are ongoing in some way, shape, or form. In some cases, they're fully enrolled at the time of approval. But we have some latitude there because it's understood that for some rare diseases, it may be impossible to have a trial ongoing at the time of approval. So we have some latitude there. And then for the withdrawal process, it is essentially a structured process. In some cases, it will involve an advisory committee so that there can be an open public discussion, that there's a public hearing that people can come and speak at. And then there is a back and forth with the company ultimately that potentially leads to a decision to withdraw. In some cases, that's what happens if the company doesn't decide to withdraw on its own. In many cases, what happens after a failed confirmatory trial is a company just decides to withdraw the product. And I don't have the statistics on how often that is, but I think at least informally, in my memory, most of the time it's a voluntary process rather than one that we have to go through by far. But I think the process has worked. The most recent time we actually had to use the scripted process as opposed to the voluntary process. I think it went relatively smoothly, and it didn't take forever. It took a little bit longer than perhaps some would have liked because we were getting used to a new process. But I think the idea is that if we make a decision now to withdraw a product, it could happen in a matter of months as opposed to years.
Great. And could you put into context the idea that a withdrawal is not necessarily an indictment of the program?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important to understand that I think, as I said, I think the most important thing to understand is that sometimes a drug may work, but the trial design was not able to demonstrate that it worked. There are examples of that, and there are some examples where in the oncology space where I can think of one drug where the drug came off the market and was studied again and was found to actually work quite well in certain settings and is now back on the market. So occasionally things that are given an accelerated approval may, they may have trouble because of the trial design, because there are limitations to how trials can be designed rather than some inherent problem with the product itself. It goes both ways. We see both things. Sometimes the product really doesn't add a lot of benefit, or sometimes products have safety concerns that become very clear as becoming as overwhelming their benefit that we don't see until they're used in larger numbers of people. So all of those things can factor in.
And Dr. Neal, you kind of mentioned this before, but talk even more maybe about the surrogate endpoints, especially in your world. And that, I've heard at conferences such as NORD, patients saying that many times that's more important to them than the quote unquote clinical endpoints, given, what they're facing and the disease they're facing in their lives.
Well, thanks for the question.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that it took me a while to figure out the difference between an intermediate clinical endpoint and a surrogate endpoint. I don't know if we want to get into that particular wrinkle, but so it's a good question to ask, why are we talking about these surrogate endpoints? I think we have mentioned already, it may have been Dr. Marks who pointed out that a surrogate endpoint is a substitute for measuring directly how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And they could be things like the shrinkage of a tumor, or the correction of a laboratory value, or the improvement of radiological findings on imaging studies. Those things are not things that people are going to feel. They're not necessarily things that would directly impact their function, and they wouldn't have time to affect their survival. But they all might reasonably likely predict that, if you are changing course in a positive direction, as you can sort of measure biochemically, or at the level of the tissue, or at the level of the imaging, if you're changing the biological course of the disease and you can measure that, and you're just doing it early enough that it's not leading to a direct change in function during the course of the study, you're ahead of the game, not behind it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. We talked about some of these criticisms, and then we talked about some of the proposals, that there's been some calls for reform. Can I ask, what do you see some of the, the impact of these calls for reform or proposals without understanding maybe the full context of the program? And what are your concerns with that? Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Neal.
I'm sorry, having just answered the last one, and I was kind of rehashing some of that in my mind. I thought
Okay.
I was betting the next one was going to go to somebody else. So,
how about you, Dr. Marks? Just.
I'm gonna. I just have to be as someone at the agency. I'll be a little bit circumspect here, but say that I think we feel that that accelerated approval is a very important tool that we have. I don't find any great faults in it. I think that we continue to make tweaks to it. We'll continue to make tweaks to it to make sure that the process of getting confirmatory evidence is as smooth as it can be, that we try to do our best to make the fewest mistakes where things actually have to be withdrawn by using our best statistical methods, et cetera. But I think it's an invaluable tool, and to not have it, or to have it significantly limited, would potentially do a disservice, particularly as we enter the area where we're dealing with patients with cancer who are at the end of the line of therapy, as was just noted, or particularly in the rare disease space where oftentimes there's just nothing out there. Patients with, we see this, many of the rare genetic diseases end up, the neurologic diseases end up with seizure disorders, intellectual decline, and if you're a parent who's watching that, being able to intervene 6 months, a year sooner because of an accelerated approval may make the difference between having a child that can speak some words or be nonverbal. So I think the program, when you think about it, it's a benefit risk of the program, but the risk of, as long as we are controlled risk managers, right, the risk of making mistakes is well worth the potential benefits in seeing people in need receive important treatments.
That's great. Thank you. How about Silas? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was thinking as I'm listening to the discussion, we're really, talking about uncertainty here. And I think, that's the difficult thing about, I think, the program. The program is managing uncertainty and looking at data we have in hand in the moment and making a judgment. And we're trusting that it's there, and we're trusting that it's going to bear out in the future. And when we were interested in doing our study in that question, and like that seemed to be the kernel of the question for critique. And it seems like, so we decided, let's look back and see, how did it end up resolving? Like all these things that got approved with accelerated approval, what ended up happening? What data ended up coming out? And then if we had the ability to know that information at the moment, we actually might be more confident that we're making good decisions, because what we see in this analysis is that and the net benefit is 263,000 life years gained for these oncology patients. And so I think that it seems to me that was an impetus for our study, and probably the kernel of critique. And we're hoping that this study can provide evidence that we're making decisions.
Before I go to Dr. Nealon, if you have any more thoughts, I do want to reiterate, please, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. I'm seeing people raise their hands, but we're going to use the chat to answer any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Dr. Nealon or Jenny, anything you want to add to that?
I'd like to reiterate that we feel like the accelerated approval pathway is very important for rare diseases, and value the study that was talked about here today, because it helps to strengthen that case. Nor it is afraid of confusion around, what's an accelerated approval mean, and a little bit wary of, imposing changes on a system that will further confuse people when the current system is already structured, as both Dr. Marks and Silas have mentioned, to balance a benefit risk calculation for the benefit of patients. And so not that it's perfect. I think Dr. Mark said it's not perfect, but it is a good fit for the needs we're trying to address. Requires good evidence about safety and full analysis of the manufacturing and so forth, and reasonably likely to be clinically benefit. And that seems like the right point to say, well, then let's try to get it to patients, particularly if they have no other option.
Great. Jenny?
Well, nothing is perfect. And as we're all saying, if this is a decision that patients can help make with their doctors too, once something is approved. There are instances in myeloma where the drug wasn't that awesome and had a lot of side effects, and it didn't have to get pulled by the FDA because patients just didn't want to use it. So, some of that real world shared decision making with patients and providers needs to happen. And you have another situation where something went away and something might be coming back. The same drug might be coming back in myeloma. So with further studies, so I agree, sometimes it's a clinical trial design issue and not necessarily the drug. That we've seen that happen before in multiple things. So this is an imperative program to maintain. That's what I would say is from the patient community.
Thank you, Jenny. With that, in the remaining time we have left, why don't we look towards the future? How about I start with all of you, and kind of what do you want to see happen in accelerated approvals moving forward? And Dr. Marks, I'd like to start with you.
I think you're going to see us robustly using accelerated approvals in the area of gene therapies. I think we want to leverage the science behind them, the statistical designs, use of novel statistical methods to maximize our chances of getting it right. So I think you'll see us doing that. I think you'll see us also putting care into making sure that we exert due diligence about making sure that the trials that are where we have programs where trials have been used to give an accelerated approval, that they are confirmed in subsequent confirmatory studies. In some cases, those confirmatory studies may simply be the original trial providing longer term data. So it doesn't always, that's one important thing I didn't mention, especially in the rare disease space. In some cases, the same trial that may produce an accelerated approval may yield the results necessary to convert the accelerated approval to a traditional approval. So again, we want to be as efficient as we can with the drug development process, because with limited dollars, the more efficient we are, the more products will ultimately get developed.
That's great. Silas, how about you?
Well, I'd like to, pick up on some of that. I see, the science is evolving very quickly, and it really does offer the promise of new treatments for patients. And this pathway seems, as we've been discussing, to enable different pathways for that, and to get those treatments to the patients that need it. I mean, Jenny illustrated well that even with numbers of therapies in certain disease areas, there can be improvements, because patients fail therapies, and even in therapies where there are treatment areas where there are nothing, it's even more unmet need. And I think, as a researcher, I endorse the use of evidence to think about policy and think about evidence to use to shape policy. And if we are to make changes or different proposals, we want to make sure to have that evidence. And that's something that we want to make sure to continue to support and improve the program.
Thank you. Dr. Nealon.
Well, I think my answer is fundamentally the same as Dr. Marks. Hope to see the accelerated approval pathway, which, as we've said to date, has been used most in oncology, applied more widely. And to see, as there are efforts underway to do that, there's more coordination, within FDA about, when to apply it.
And Jenny, as our patient, and also I know the great work you do with HealthTree, I'd like you to close out the discussion.
Yeah, I think accelerated approval is an innovative program, and we need that innovation to continue. The FDA has many innovation type programs that they're launching because they see this need too. It's really important that this continues. One example of innovation and trying to help clinical trials run faster is we have a product that we created called HealthTree Cure Hub, where we go directly to patients. We invite them to share their records, and we open that up to researchers. Could that data be used for real-world evidence, for clinical trials designs or phase 3 trials? Yes, I think it could. I think we need to continue innovating because patients are waiting and patients are still dying.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments there. We have a few minutes for questions. I have one prior to the conversation. What are the appropriate points in the clinical development and post-market cycle for patient groups to engage with the FDA, with providers and manufacturers? And can the panel members share examples of best practices of collaboration across different stakeholders? Anybody would like to start with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to just say that it's never too early. I think the important thing about patients being involved early on is that although patients generally may not have, or they sometimes do, but they might not always have an idea of what biomarker they want to have measured, they certainly are the best ones to go to understand what's meaningful in terms of how they feel function in terms of endpoints. And so I think, product developers need to involve them early on. They should feel empowered here. And I think it's also important that, that their thoughts about what kind of studies they'd be willing to participate in, all of that can be taken into account as this goes through the process. I think the time I'll tell you the time not to get patients involved is to wait till the very end when a product is like borderline on life support and try to get it over the end. That's not if that's just the time you're going to decide you're going to get patients involved, that's not a good use. the time is early on and throughout the development process, because I think it does provide a tremendous amount of information. And I'd say there's another thing for product developers and for regulators, which is interactions with patients around this process are incredibly motivating. To see that what you're doing is actually making a difference or potentially making a difference in people's lives makes stuff that we normally see on paper come alive and can really help the process move forward.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Marks. How about Jenny from a patient perspective and a patient
Oh
advocacy?
yeah, I echo those comments. I mean, it's just significant. Patients should be involved in every aspect of clinical trial design. And there are some patients who are highly educated, they understand the landscape, they run support groups, so they talk to hundreds, if not thousands of patients. They can give you a very informed background about what you're up against, what your competition is in the clinical trial space, or how patients are thinking about strategically, because I feel like myeloma is a chess game. So we feel like, okay, you're going to take step one. Does that preclude me from future trials? Or does this trial preclude me from different treatments? So that's how patients are thinking about their therapies strategically. And if you don't understand that level of thinking, you're going to get really far down the road and then be surprised why you can't recruit for your trials. So patients should always be involved in every aspect of clinical trial design.
Right. Dr. Marks, we have a question about speaking a little bit more about the process for getting a surrogate endpoint validated so it could be used for traditional approval and the FDA's role in that.
So we have, so let me just make sure that just by way of backing up a little bit, there are biomarkers that can be used for individual programs, and their companies can validate those. Those are sometimes proprietary, even biomarkers unique to a given program. On the other hand, there are validated biomarkers or validated surrogate endpoints, which means they've gone through a process whereby FDA has worked with the sponsor to say, we've seen enough data in terms of the correlation of how that biomarker works with outcomes that we're able to say that if that biomarker changes, it's good enough, not for even an accelerated approval, but for a full approval. Example might be blood pressure and cardiovascular endpoints, but there are also a whole list now. And I'd encourage someone to get on. We have a biomarker qualification program. If you search FDA biomarker qualification program, you'll see that there's a whole process where someone submits a letter of an intent, and then we have a dialogue back and forth, and we'll work with people to help qualify biomarkers.
That's great. Well, with that, we've come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your time, your expertise, your stories with us today. I think this is a very important topic, and I hope that everyone who joined us today learned a lot. Thank you very much. We do have questions we did not get to. I'll share them with our panelists. And with that, I hand it back to Kana.
Thank you everyone for joining. So we wish you nice Halloween. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.